everybody. Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. It is almost sunset on August 23rd, 2020, the third, moving into the fourth day of Elul, 5780. And I'm very honored to have with me, zooming in from Miami, I am of course in Israel, Rabbi Pynchas Brener, who is no less than the ambassador from Venezuela to Israel, among quite a few other things. So Rabbi Brener, thank you so much for joining me today on the Land of Israel Network.
Thank you for allowing me to be with you and to get to your audience.
So perhaps I ran across your blog and also some of your YouTubes, Coffee and Faith, and you seem to give a delightful message, of course, in English and of course in Spanish. But perhaps tell my listeners a little bit about your background and what brought you to where you are today.
Well, I was born in Poland, but my late father received an invitation to go to Peru in South America, because a number of people from my mother's hometown, where I was born also, had settled in Peru. And the community grew, and they felt they needed the services of a rabbi who could do many other things. My late father was also a shochet, a moel. He knew everything that somebody in the religious field should know, except for one thing. And he always told me he regrets that he wasn't a sofer, because during the Second World War, sometimes you needed to do something in a Sefer Torah, and he didn't want to touch that because he didn't know Safros. But everything else he did. So thank God for that. My late father left in August 1934.
Oh my.
Lima, Peru. And in December, his wife and 3 sons left Poland after he settled in. And we arrived in January 1936 to Lima, Peru. And that's where I spent my youth until I finished high school. And then my father shipped me off to Yeshiva University. And I lived in New York for 20 years. And I was a rabbi in New York for 12 years. And then came the call to go to Venezuela. And I was in Venezuela for 44 years.
Wow.
Now a number of years that I'm retired.
So your family, just to go back to World War II, I mean, thank God you got out of Germany right before everything was crashing down. Out of Poland, out of German clutches right before World War II. But I imagine that you had family that was left behind in Poland. Were you able, because you were in Peru, to try and get them out? How did that work?
They all perished.
All of them. Wow. Wow. So being in South America saved you. Your father's
absolutely
unbelievable.
My father wanted to see the big world. That's the truth. And when that opportunity came, he simply left because he felt there is a great world out there, because we lived in villages, really. I was born in the Middle Ages, you know. Electricity never failed in the village. We had no electricity, no running water. And when in Peru, it was, wow.
Really, it was very much ahead of Poland. So, you know, I'm curious because my husband and I were in Portugal just about a year ago. September, it'll be a year. And we went on a trip, my listeners have heard this before, B'kvot Anusim, you know, looking for the remains of Jews from the Inquisition, Portugal and Spain, many of whom either as crypto-Christian or Jews or as hidden Christians actually fled to South America. And we learned a lot about people who had gone to Brazil. I have since met people who came back to Judaism, who found out that they had Jewish roots from Mexico, from Brazil. Was that the situation also in Peru, or not so much, the hidden Jews?
No, I don't think so.
No?
But the number of descendants from Marranos, obviously, I remember we had a neighbor next door in Lima, Peru. Somebody passed away, and for 7 days, they didn't leave the house. They had no idea why, but they
they weren't Jewish, non-Jewish neighbors.
No, not at all. But they knew that in their family, after somebody dies, you stay home for 7 days. Well,
So clearly they had some Jewish roots, and this is one of the things that held on. Yes, right, and people who, everyone in the family is allergic to pork, or you light 2 candles Friday night, right? So, but they don't remember why. So what was the Jewish community like in Lima?
And Lima was great. It still is very good. At the time when we were there, when I was there were about 6,000 Jews, I remember. Today, it's more like 2,500 to 3,000, because they had a dictator that was a leftist, and at that time, many people left Peru. And once you leave, and especially if the children become integrated to the new environment, most people don't turn back, even if the situation changes.
Was there anti-Semitism in Venezuela, either from classic anti-Semitism, which your family managed to escape from Europe?
You asked me about Peru, now you're asking me about Venezuela. Is that it?
Yeah, no. I'm so excited about all these places that you've been to. So first Peru, and then afterwards Venezuela. Was there a difference between them?
The United States, from Peru, I went to the United States.
I know, right.
Then I went to Venezuela. The reason I went to Venezuela is because I was there on a mission of the Rabbinical Council of America a few years before in order to help them with some publications or what have you. And it was the first time that the Jewish community in Venezuela met an Orthodox rabbi who spoke Spanish, because all their rabbis up to then were Yiddish-speaking rabbis. So they took an interest in me, but they didn't have a synagogue yet. They had just a big hole in the ground. They were going to build a synagogue. And then they got in touch with me 4.5 years later and asked me if I'd be interested in coming. They already built the synagogue and so on. They invited me to come for a week. I went with my wife and we came to an agreement eventually, and this is how I ended up. The reason I really went is because I felt that I have the added value of Spanish. While in New York, there are 1,000 rabbis that can do the same thing as I can do. But in Peru, or in that case, in Venezuela, maybe there weren't too many candidates that could fill that. So I felt I really should return to Latin America. And I thought I was going there for 5 years. It ended up 44.
For some of us, the year 2020 is looking like that, just like a lot longer than the usual. Right. So what was the Jewish community, excuse me for mixing up Venezuela and Peru before, what was the community like there in Venezuela?
Oh, great. Also? I don't think there's a community like that anywhere in the world. The Jewish community, great. Such strong ties with Israel, you know, and an interchange at all times, you know. I remember once Menachem Begin and his late wife, Aliza, had dinner in our house on a Friday night. He gave me a copy of his book, Hamered, and he autographed it. You know, at that time, maybe I didn't feel that much of an importance to it. I appreciate it. I don't want to say, he certainly was a tremendous gentleman, you know, great. But that was before he was prime minister. I think he didn't even dream at that time that he would ever become prime minister. But I was raised in Lima, Peru, in Beitar. That is the movement of the revisionists. Vladimir Jabotinsky, Zev Jabotinsky was our leader. And I remember when he passed away in 1940, I think it was, in Long Island in some camp of Beitar, he passed away. Well, we put up a picture of Jabotinsky with a black ribbon around it and a candle in front, and we stood guard for 24 hours. Every hour, the guard would change, a boy and a girl would stand. And I was one of the pairs that stood guard for the picture of Zev Jabotinsky. Zionism was always an integral part of my life, aside from, you know, what the Torah tells us in Jewish tradition. It was a political Zionism, was also an integral part of my life. And the Jewish community in Venezuela was so close to that, you couldn't die without contributing to the Keren HaYesod. You couldn't make a bar mitzvah without doing it. You know, they made sure that everybody contributed to the Keren HaYesod, and there was this constant interchange between people traveling and going, and many people settled there, of course, as well.
And there was Jewish education? There was a day school?
Well, we had a day school with about 2,300 children. That was the main day school of the community. It now has about 600. More than three quarters of the Jewish population of Venezuela left.
Because of the political situation?
Absolutely, only because of that.
Were there kidnappings there as well? I remember a few years ago being friendly with someone.
Right now, you don't hear that much about it, but a few years ago it was tremendous.
Jewish people taken hostage, and the families had to pay ransom.
Ransom.
Right. Wow. So what was, I mean, you lived there for 44 years, you lived there through a lot of turbulent times.
Until the year 1998, which is when the late Chavez became president. It was great. You had 40 years of democracy in Venezuela, you know, a very tolerant people. You know, I had access to everybody in Venezuela, from the president down, all the religious leaders, everything was open. But then we thought, you know, people get tired, unfortunately, of the good things also. They become routine, you know, the same thing, and there's always something wrong. You know, no system is perfect. Winston Churchill said, among the imperfect, democracy is the best among the bad ones.
Right.
There's no good system, really, so that people become dissatisfied and they thought there's corruption. You know, here comes a military guy, a colonel. He's going to put order into the country, because years prior, there was once a dictator. If you didn't mix into politics, life was great. You could live with your doors open, no crime. They thought once again there'll be no corruption or what have you. But it turned out to be something altogether different, because this guy was a communist, really.
You know, I think what you're saying now maybe should be heard by a lot of people in Western countries who I think, including people here in Israel, I would say, but not only, who I think are taking for granted some of the greatness of the countries that they live in, and maybe complaining a little bit too much or exaggerating some of the bad things that there are. And as you said, in every country, there's going to be corruption and bad people and things going on that shouldn't go on, and racism and certain things like that. But without understanding that the alternative can be much worse, which is exactly what happened to Venezuela. So maybe that's a message that should be heard through your experience of, you know, what you lived through and destroyed the country.
Well, let me tell you, I believe that if you want to opine, if you want to say something about Israel's political system, move there, go there. If you don't live in Israel, just support Israel. But I agree 100% with you. You know, people get tired of that. In the United States, we're going through a very difficult time right now with the election. There's a lot of left leanings. Who knows where this is taking us? Many people are not so worried, but personally I am. I think that we're turning a little bit too much left, but I'm in the United States, so I
yes, you're in Miami.
States. By the way, I'm a great admirer of Netanyahu, I want you to know. And I think that the latest deal with the United Arab Emirates is a great deal, even though some people, you know, detracted. Nobody's ever satisfied. You know, there's a word in Hebrew, lefargen. Do you know what that means?
I most certainly do.
Actually, it's not a Hebrew word. It's a Yiddish word, because there is no such concept. I don't know how to say lefargen in Spanish or in English even. It's a very Jewish thing. Mefagint. Somehow.
I'm searching for the word in English. It doesn't translate.
I don't think there's a real good word for it. Rabbi Soloveitchik once said, he was my Revere teacher, as he was the Revere teacher of Rabbi Riskin. Rabbi Soloveitchik once said, it's as much easier to go be Menachem Ovel somebody, you know, you feel with him, so than to really rejoice in his success. That is harder.
And for my listeners who don't speak Hebrew, don't understand Hebrew, it's easier to go and visit somebody when they're grieving and to really empathize with them then than it is to really feel happy for them when things go well for them. So, yeah.
That's what he said on one occasion.
So tell us a little bit about this Coffee and Faith that you do, and the messages, drawing on your many, many years, both in the clergy and of course living in a country that most Jews probably haven't visited, let alone lived in. How do you manage to put a fresh spin, if you will, not to be derogatory to the Torah, but how do you manage to put kind of a timely message onto the messages that you are giving out?
Okay, let me tell you, I'm basically a schizophrenic personality, you know.
Okay, is this the first time you've come public with that? No.
Well, I don't, no doctor has diagnosed with.
Okay.
But basically, you know, I have two different aspects. On the one hand, I love science. You know, I actually, when I went to Yeshiva University, I graduated in college. My major was mathematics. And then I went to Columbia University, got a master's in mathematical statistics. I was a teacher of mathematics in New York, and I was a teacher of mathematics in Venezuela as well. I love science, and I love this world. I love to read things that are not Jewish. I love music that is not Jewish, but of course I love Jewish music. And most of my reading are Jewish texts, obviously, but not exclusively. I think there's a big world out there too. And I try in my messages somehow to make it a little bit more universal. Maybe you'll be surprised that most of my audience in that program, Coffee and Faith, are non-Jews.
I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Non-Jews. Follow. You know, Jews, it's very difficult. En navi be'iro. In English, there is no prophet in his own city, you know.
Yeah.
But among non-Jews, maybe I tried the messages to be sort of universal, even though my platform, my springboard is always the Torah somehow, some Jewish source. But then I go into a tangent because I think that the Torah has a message for everybody.
Right.
This is what I try to do. But these are very brief things. I've been doing this since, I think, over 8 years now, weekly. I haven't failed yet. God should give me years.
Amen. So many of my listeners, also not Jewish, who very much appreciate the Torah, and I'm hoping that part of my interviewing today they'll see your work and start listening to some of the messages that you give out also, which I think are very pertinent. But, you know, you mentioned that you went into philosophy and into science. At some point, that was a given, that people who went into the rabbinate were also quite knowledgeable and educated about many things, including, let's say, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, right, who starts Chabad, who had a so-called secular education and also had a Torah education, were able to meld the two worlds. It seems, though, that in the past few decades, it's one or the other. It's science or Torah, to the point where many students who study Torah full-time, even from a young age, are not exposed to, let's say, mathematics or exposed to some of the scientific world. What do you feel about that? And also, maybe more importantly, why has that happened?
I really don't know why it has happened. I can imagine, but I don't have any statistics about it. I really don't want to get into that field. I think we are looking for excellence nowadays in many fields. In Torah, I think there was never a period in Jewish history where there was so much study of Torah as you have today. It's amazing what's going on.
Yeah, it's really something.
With Shas, you know, Siyum Shas, you know, finishing the Shas every 7 years.
Right.
We have so many people participating. I think we are looking for excellence in everything. We are running faster than ever before. We're playing the violin better than ever. We're looking for extremes somehow. Personally, I think that Adam, Harishon, first man, I don't think he was Jewish. Of course.
Yeah.
Okay, we're all descendants from Adam.
Right.
Okay, now Jews are also have the same spirit. It says that God gave him some kind of spirit. He blew something into his nostrils, according to the Torah. Many say that was the soul. Everybody has a soul. Non-Jews have a soul also. Their feelings and what have you, they can excel very well. And I think there is knowledge all over. The Torah for us is a tremendous book of morals and ethics, which we should never forget. I think that even nations have interest, as they say. They don't have friends. They have interest, but they should never do anything immoral. And you can see, for instance, how the armed forces of Israel, from what I read, you know, they are taught, try not to do something that is immoral. Right. Israel, when it's about to bomb someplace, alerts the civil population, get out of there because you'll be in danger. I think it is an ethical type of situation. I think that comes from our Torah. But you cannot deny that there was a guy by the name of Newton, Galilee. Einstein himself was Jewish, but you know, he wasn't a Torah Jew, really. Right. He was an assimilated Jew, but look at the tremendous influence he has had upon our civilization. Right now, I'll just give you a little example, you know. Right now, we're all fighting this pandemia, you know, COVID. What do we do with this thing? You know, why did God send this to us? Well, my reply is, I have no idea. I don't know why God does certain things. So in his plan, somehow this should be. But I do know something else, that he gave us intellect. He gave us intelligence so that we can research and we can look into the causes and we can eventually create a vaccine. We will be able to overcome it. Maybe this is some kind of obstacle so that we should grow further. We should be more knowledgeable about things. I don't know, but I don't think that God wants to destroy us. For sure not. There is a problem. We will overcome it because God gave us the talent and the ability to do it. So to study. Now, where do you find in the Talmud a recipe for the vaccine? There is no recipe for the vaccine in the Talmud. The Talmud has many indications of a medical order. Well, that reflected the knowledge then. But when I have a problem, a health problem, I don't go to the Talmud to see what the answer is. I go to a physician. I go to a hospital. So science and knowledge in general have to go hand in hand with Jewish tradition, with Jewish knowledge. I think that is the correct way. But this is my personal opinion. Not everybody obviously today agrees with that.
Yeah, absolutely not. But they're working hard in Israel. We'll see what happens. It would be beautiful if
but
at
they're
least
not working at the yeshivas. They're working elsewhere for that.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. And the yeshivas are going to benefit from it, definitely.
Okay.
You can't deny the importance of general knowledge. I think it's
But some people have gone in that direction, and other people have gone in the direction of denying God and putting all of it in the scientific basket and not understanding that there is a higher power that we are very small and very, buffeted by without really understanding the reasons. But I think what you just said now can apply to us as individuals, the obstacles that come into our lives, the personal obstacles, because at least in my life, I felt like Hashem was telling me, I know that you can do it. I know that you can get through this. Otherwise, I wouldn't give it to you. I hope that that's true. And as a people, and now as the world, I mean, we're all facing something on a global level. And we're sure that if a vaccine is developed in one country, everybody's going to be able to get it. And that would be a beautiful thing to bring people together. And as you said, that depends a lot on the science. Since you're out of Venezuela, so I feel free to ask you this question, and feel free to not answer it if you don't want to. A few years ago, you were quoted in an article about feeling intimidated about the atmosphere that was happening in Venezuela, a frightening atmosphere. There was even there were reports at one point that the Jewish community was perhaps being spied on by the government. Now that you are in the United States, which for all the chaos is nowhere near what's going on in Venezuela, can you speak a little bit about that time and what it was like to live under, I guess, in a fear society to some degree? Were you there? Were you there for a long time then in that situation?
Of course. Well, we had a synagogue that was invaded and desecrated, and these weren't just plain robbers. This was obviously directed from above. School was intervened. They were looking for arms, and we felt a little bit that the Jewish community was being singled out. Maybe this was to show the Arab world, who are the greatest supporters of this revolution that we have in Venezuela, which is really a dictatorship. They wanted to show them that we can also do something against the Jews. But the last few years, I wouldn't say that there is anything any policy that is directed against the Jews. Jews are leaving because they are middle class, and the middle class is suffering tremendously. I receive an old age pension in Venezuela. I worked there, I paid Social Security, and I have a son who lives there still, even though his family is in Miami, but he goes back and forth. Right now, he's stuck in Venezuela. You can't get out these days because
Really?
Right. But in any event, he manages whatever little thing I have in Venezuela. So I get monthly from Social Security. Guess how much I get Social Security? Don't guess. Okay. $1.25 monthly was the latest payment.
$1.25?
Was the latest payment. The average salary there is $2, $3, $4, $5 a month. Some get very little. And if you have help here in Miami, at least in the neighborhood where I live, it's $100 a day. $100 a day. And there you have somebody earning a month $4, $5, $6. You know, how can you possibly make ends meet? The idea, many say that they want to keep the people very poor so that you should have no time for anything else, trying to find out a little extra food or have you, and you shouldn't have any ideas about liberty, about revolution, because you're occupied with providing the most elementary things for your family. Of course, there's a sector, a privileged sector that has money, that lives very well because of these low wages. You can have many services. You can have people cleaning your house for $5, $8, $10, $20 a month. You can have a chauffeur. You can have many things. Of course, at night you can't go out because people are very afraid. And then again, electricity doesn't function all the time. Then your Wi-Fi doesn't function. There is no water. You live in a terrible situation. So many people have generators in their home, those that can afford it, of course. But the majority of the population is living in subhuman conditions right now.
The world doesn't seem to get too focused on that, or you think that there's room here for more attention to be paid, or there's nothing that we could do anyway, the good people in the world?
Let me tell you something. I am not speaking right now as a representative of the government. There are other people that speak for the government. Venezuela right now has a totalitarian regime, a dictatorship, but also the presence of drug traffickers right there. Also, guerrillas from Colombia occupy part of the territory. Also, armed bands that the government sponsors that do things that the armed forces won't do. In addition, Russia has interest. In addition, China has interest. In addition, Cuba, according to the former president Raúl Castro, has 20,000 people in Venezuela. So you can multiply this by 3 or 4. Venezuela is really a colony of Cuba. How can a people without arms oppose a regime like that also has international support? So you can say that the interim government of Guaido also has international support. The United States and European countries and 60 countries in the world recognize Guaido as the president. But they are never in Venezuela. In Venezuela, the Chinese are there. The Russians are there. The Cubans are there in the territory. So how can people fight against them unless the support that Guaido has translates itself a little bit also inside the country? Now, there has to be political will for that if you want to do it. Nowadays, it's not a question of an invasion of troops on the ground. That isn't. Nowadays, there's so many different means of doing things of a military angle that do not imply really people there. But you know, every country, unfortunately, fortunately, looks out for itself. It should look out for somebody else also, but they stop looking out for themselves.
I'm just thinking about getting food to the people there, irrespective of what craziness is happening all around. The poor little people there are suffering, it sounds like, tremendously. And it's really heartbreaking.
They tried to get aid in, and the government didn't permit, because they thought the aid will show that there isn't enough food in the country, which they claim isn't true. And on the other hand, they're afraid what comes with the aid also.
Now, Iran also is connected with Venezuela.
I didn't mention Iran. Hezbollah is there. Hamas is there. Iran had last month, when no flights were allowed, like 19 flights of one of their airlines come into Venezuela. What do they bring in? What do they take out? Where does Venezuela come to Iran? Iran is thousands of miles away from Venezuela. You know, the real neighborhood of Venezuela is South America, Latin America, the United States, Canada, that maybe Europe, but the Americas is the first, and they have dealings with Iran. Not only that, they just opened up a supermarket. where they bring in Iranian food, a big supermarket that was there but failed because of different problems with the government. So they took over and they're bringing in food. It's a question of the Islamization of Venezuela, the cultural penetration as well. Not only arms and what have you, and drugs, who knows what else, but it's even cultural also. I think that the United States should really take greater interest in what's going on. And even though the United States is doing a lot of things, I'm not saying no, but I think not sufficient, because you still have that government in power and they should be out. Without them being out, there's no chance for any kind of progress for Venezuela.
That's what it sounds like. They're building mosques when you talk about a cultural infiltration as well, or not so?
There were mosques before. I remember Saudi Arabia built a very big mosque in the neighborhood where I lived, but there was a different kind of interest. You know, nowadays you feel it's like to take over the country, to assimilate the country, to integrate it into the Arab world. And this should be of interest to Israel as well, because you know, the greatest enemy of Israel nowadays is Iran. Yeah. It's the only country that is threatening to destroy it. And now they're taking more than a foothold in Latin America and using Venezuela as a base.
It seems when you look at the globe, many of us talk about the Western world, but really when you look at the globe, the difference between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, the countries, is so stark, with a few exceptions in the Southern Hemisphere. Let's say Australia, New Zealand, for example, South Africa, maybe at some point. It just seems like, you know, the Southern Hemisphere is having a much harder time getting decent leadership, making progress, joining the developing world. Do you have any thoughts on why that could be?
No, I can just repeat what I read. You know, they claim, you know, in the North, winter comes, unless you prepare for winter, you'll freeze. In the Southern Hemisphere, there are no such winters really, especially around the equator. You know, countries around the Italy, you can see the difference between Northern Italy and Southern Italy. There you have the difference already.
Yeah.
But it's much more marked in Latin America. Maybe it also has to do with the Spanish conquest. You know, the Spaniards are the ones that conquered Latin America basically and established their way of living. And that's a Mediterranean culture. Spain is really in between the North and the South. You know, it's not the same. You see, where the British came to Latin America, the islands that they at one time colonized, they left working governments much better than what the Spaniards did. Maybe it has to do with climate. I'm not too sure. I don't know why, but that is a fact.
Very interesting. Although Africa, you know, has had its share of the European conquests as colonies, and they're probably doing even worse than South America, if that's even possible. So
worse than Venezuela,
it's an interesting world
nowadays. Very difficult, worse than Venezuela.
You know, I hear the undercurrent of I don't know, pain, but after spending a good part of your life there, I hear, you know, you're sad that this is a place where it had so much potential and sounded like really such an incredible society in terms of tolerance and openness, and was destroyed. It's so difficult to build something and so easy to destroy it. It takes so few people to destroy something. And you know, through your life and through your experiences there, I'm hearing, as I hope my listeners are as well, that, like, I don't know the word exactly, that undercurrent of oi. Oh, you can't translate oi either, but I hope my listeners know what that means. Like, it's just sad. It's really sad. It's really sad.
It was a great place. Not only, it has the most wonderful climate, beaches.
Really?
Whatever you want, Venezuela has.
What is their natural, what did they produce in the good days?
They have
mainly oil?
They have the largest oil reserves in the world. And today, they don't produce gasoline. They have to import gasoline. They have this revolution has destroyed anything it has touched. It's unfortunate. It was such a great country it's not only what they destroyed, I always argue. It's also what happened during 20 years. Take Israel 20 years ago and take Israel today. Is it the same Israel?
Not even
Now,
close.
Venezuela went back, but it also did not go forward like all other countries did. You expect things to develop, by the way, not only oil, sweet water, agriculture, minerals, tourism can be a great source of income for Venezuela. There isn't anything that Venezuela doesn't have. Unfortunately, you know, maybe God doesn't give us everything in one place. You know, he gave too much to Venezuela and then people don't appreciate what they have. So
and others got jealous and came to take it.
Nowadays, they're beginning to appreciate.
So let's move on to the next phase of your life, which God willing is going to be Israel. Once things start, you know, you can start flying again and people can move to where they want to go. You're associated with Bar Ilan University. What is that association about?
Well, I'm a member of the Board of Governors.
It's a good one.
Okay, and I think that it also represents my philosophy, so to speak. You know, you have Torah, and you also have general science. They accept every student. If you want to wear a kippah, you wear a kippah. If you don't want to wear a kippah, you don't wear a kippah. I am against any kind of obligatory measures. I hate that. I think you have to leave it to people's decision, but you have to give him the instruments to be able to make a decision. In other words, somebody who has never tasted Jewish tradition cannot choose. If he has a religious education, a Torah education, a traditional, and later on he decides he doesn't want to live that kind of life, okay, that's his choice. But those who never had the opportunity, that's tinok shenishbu. Those are children that were kidnapped somehow and never had the opportunity to see what the...
Not literally, figuratively.
What the alternatives are. So I think this is... I think that's what Bar Ilan, I'm very close to it. And you know, the first chancellor, not president, chancellor of Bar Ilan was a Rabbi Joseph H. Lookstein. He was a teacher of mine at Yeshiva University, for instance. And he was in my home in Caracas, Venezuela, for the bar mitzvah of my second son, for instance. You know, I have very close relationship with many people in Bar Ilan, in addition, of course, to their ideology, which I think is very good. On the other hand, I love Tel Aviv University. I love Hebrew University too, the first university before there was a state in 1925. Somebody dreamt already of that. I think there's room for everybody. I don't like coercion. I like freedom. I like choice. I think God gave us bechira chofshit. Free will. And I think the trouble is, and I'll tell you one Devar Torah, so you'll know that I'm a rabbi, and I'll repeat something I heard from Zalman Shazar, who was a president of Israel. In Nitzavim, toward the end of the Torah, it says the following: God says, I give you life and death, I give you this and that, and choose life. So President Shazar said, the Torah should never have said choose life, because the Torah believes in freedom of choice. So the Torah should have said, life, death, curse, blessing, and you choose, you do whatever you want. But the Torah said, no, choose life. So he said something I thought was brilliant at the time. You know what our problem is? The Torah is really telling us, here is life, here is death, uvachata, and choose. Wait, if you choose, you certainly will choose life. The problem is that we don't choose. You know, most of the time, we don't make decisions. Things just happen and that's it. But when you think with your head and you're aware of what's going on, would you, the day before you have a test, go to the movies? You'd study for the test. If you're responsible, the trouble is that we don't take things that seriously. We don't choose many a time in life. And I think what you have to give people is the ability to choose, but also instruct them. You must choose. Before you take action, take a look at what the consequences are, because mistakes have consequences also. Good deeds have consequences also. You know, this is what it says in Shema, the second paragraph. If you're going to listen to my commandments, things will happen. If you don't listen, other things will happen. So make sure you choose. Okay?
Yep.
Let me tell you something about Israel, since you asked me. The state with Venezuela and Israel do not have diplomatic relations. Even though right after the state was established, Venezuela was one of the first countries to recognize Israel. They established their embassy in Jerusalem, but then a few years later, for some political reasons, they moved to Tel Aviv like many other countries did. And in 2009, which is a little over 10 years ago, the previous president, Chavez, broke off relations with the state of Israel, unilaterally, on television. And he told the ambassador, you have 72 hours to get out of here.
Mm-hmm.
He was a tremendous guy, terrible, terrible guy. And since then, there are no diplomatic relations between Israel. But this government, the interim government of Juan Guaido, wants to establish relations with Israel. They named me ambassador as a first step. Right now, we are working on the recognition of each other so that the relationship, the diplomatic relationship should happen again. Because in the meantime, Israel does not want to recognize me as an ambassador, but as the representative of this interim president Guaido, because they say there are no diplomatic relations. We are working right now in the National Assembly, which is the Venezuelan Knesset, that they should establish the formal diplomatic relations with Israel. And I hope this will come through in a few weeks.
And then you'll be able to present your credentials to President Rivlin here. And
if I can fly, I certainly will go to the president to present credentials. And there are a number of Venezuelans that want to be present there when we finally do that after so many years. Because I'll tell you something else also. Israel can provide Venezuela with a lot of things for the day after when there's no dictatorship, how to deal with terrorism, how to deal with safety, with security, in addition to things that Israel already helped in the past, like water, agriculture, and so on. But there's something else also, and I don't tire of underlining that also. We also have many things in common. We are democratic people. We love freedom. In other words, Israel, we recognize that Israel is the only country in the Middle East that is a democracy. The rest are either tyrannies, or monarchies, or theocracies. You know, democracy isn't there. And this was the big failure, the claim of the previous American administration when they tried to convert Iraq into a democratic. This is not, they don't know how to eat that. That's not their meat. So Israel and Venezuela really have things in common when it comes to morality, human rights, respect for human rights, in addition to other interests that may be of a political, economic order. And I think it would be very important for the relations to once again to be established like they were before, and to put the embassy in Jerusalem, because we're not moving. We're not moving from Tel Aviv because there is no embassy in Tel Aviv. If we're starting, let's start with the right foot in Jerusalem.
And it sounds like you're going to make an amazing ambassador. And who knows, you might be in the waiting room for President Rivlin along with the ambassador from the UAE. Stranger things have happened.
Who knows? That would be great. That would be
some kind of new world. Well, from your mouth to God's ears, as they say.
Amen.
Okay, Rabbi Brener, thank you so much for an absolutely delightful conversation. And I am, after the holidays, I actually took your advice before I even spoke to you, because I made a choice. Instead of sitting here and waiting for the tourists, who I don't know when they're going to come, so I made a choice to go for another master's degree in the land of Israel studies and archaeology at Bar-Ilan University, because I agree with you. I very much enjoy and appreciate the way that they teach, the combination of science and Torah, and the openness of the campus and the variety of professors there. So that's what I'm going to be doing after the holidays, starting school once again.
Let me add one thing to you.
Yes.
Agatha Christie was married to an archaeologist.
I knew that.
Okay, so they asked her once, how is it like being married to an archaeologist? So she answered, every year that passes, he finds me more interesting.
The older you get, the better it looks. Yes.
Well, archaeology.
Absolutely. Archaeology.
Okay.
Archaeology.
Success to you, and there's nothing like keeping your mind busy. I think that is the most important thing.
I am going to agree. So thank you everyone for listening. Let's thanks to Rabbi Pynchas Brener. And if you want to follow him and some of the work that he is doing, what YouTube channel or where can they find you?
Facebook.com/Rabbi Brener, Brener with one N.
Okay.
Rabbi Brener with one N. Facebook.com/Rabbi Brener, Brener with one N. And I also have a site of my own, PynchasBrener.com, PynchasBrener.com. But if you go to YouTube, it's good enough.
Okay, sounds terrific. I hope to see you on this side of the pond, as they say. In the meantime, be well, and thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. And thanks to Tabitha and to Ben and everybody else associated with getting this podcast out. And I hope you're all well, everyone out there. So it's Eve Harow. Take care. Goodbye, everybody, for now.